By 1991, the BBC's A Question of Sport had long been established as a national favourite, providing living rooms around the country with genuine light entertainment and enjoyable challenge by way of a cast of sporting stars from the past and present. Bill Beaumont was the team captain that enjoyed the more recognisable guest for the episode, which aired on the evening of Tuesday 28th of October 1991. Up against Ian Botham's team of the British Open squash champion, Lisa Opie for those of you who didn't know, and the then IBF World Flyweight champion Dave McCauley, Beaumont was joined by the England Test bowler and future show captain himself, Phil Tufnell, and the Leeds United and Scotland captain Gordon Strachan. By then, Strachan was already cultivating a reputation for a sharp and quick wit, at least by footballing standards, and so he would prove that evening. Which Scottish football internationalist, asked the host David Coleman, took 2 wickets in the NatWest Trophy? Andy Gorham took the 2 wickets, Strachan replied, but he didn't make any catches. The majority of those in the studio would have found it funny as a kind of generic gag about a goalkeeping colleague, a Scottish one no less, but anyone watching with a passing interest in Scottish football would have known that it was more pointed than that. Andy Gorham was having a torrid start to his time at Rangers. After telling Hibs that he wanted to move that summer in order to win trophies, he'd already been held responsible for Rangers' elimination in 2 different cup competitions. The following night, after that show was released, Rangers would lose 3-2 to a young Dundee United side at Tannadice, with Gorham responsible for the late winner, spilling a Darren Jackson shot straight to the feet of Duncan Ferguson and presenting him with a simple opportunity to give United both points. Gorham had always assumed that crises of confidence happened to others, not him, and yet here he was, in a maelstrom of doubt, desperately hoping that the ball would come nowhere near him during games, and with his international captain making him a punchline on national television. Pressure on Andy Gorham inevitably meant pressure on Walter Smith. The ideal consistency candidate for a caretaker role in the aftermath of the Souness departure was now being questioned as the man to take Rangers on to the next level in the longer term. Smith had overseen yet another early European exit, but in the shape of Sparta Prague, he could not at the time point to undisputed quality in the way that Souness had been able to do so with Bayern Munich and Red Star Belgrade. Even the Skull League Cup, where a Rangers appearance in the final felt as if it was part of the sponsor's contract, had been given up at the semi-final stage. Smith's big turnover of players in the summer had led to predictable early difficulties in squad cohesion, and he yet to find a solution to the 3-striker issue that had dogged the previous season, opting to start with Souness's preferred combination of Haitley and Johnson, before chopping and changing every week throughout October. This culmination of this frustration was a touchline clash with St Johnstone manager Alex Totten, whom he replaced as assistant manager at Ibrox 5 years earlier, which saw both men charged under breach of the peace. Never having had this overall responsibility, he was being constantly questioned about his signings and his ability to manage them. I learned that management is a difficult game, wrote Smith 3 years later, and there was a brief period where I questioned my own credentials. By the end of the season, however, a national joke was on his way to becoming the greatest ever Rangers goalkeeper, the greatest Rangers strike partnership had been firmly established, and a band of brothers had been created that would go on to shape the greatest ever season in the club's history. From a position of deep doubt and great uncertainty, Walter Smith had created Alchemy. To discuss the origins of that season, I'm joined by David Edgar. How are we, David? COVID accepted.
Yeah, apart from COVID, I'm good, thank you. Yes, it's nice to be back on Dominant, and a huge season, huge period in Rangers history, I think, and a huge period in my life. And it's funny that I look back on this, and I had always thought of Walter's first 2 years as basically this straight line upwards, and the reason it felt like such a straight line upwards, I now realise when you go back and you look at things, is because it started at a fairly low level with doubts and criticism and concerns, and time, because of the second half of that season and of course the complete next one, time erodes that. But there were doubts. I particularly remember I thought maybe Keith Wright had killed Andy Gorham's fledgling Rangers career, and the fanzines at the time and the phone-ins at the time were as brutal as anything you would see in modern social media. So it'll be good to have an opportunity to discuss that, knowing, as we do, that it has a happy ending.
It does indeed. Any regular listeners to the show will know that David Edgar being on means that Alan Bradley joins him. How are we, Alan?
Yeah, I'm really good, Martyn. Yeah, and like David, looking forward to this one. I mean, I think as David said, what we're talking about 30 years ago. So originally you look back and you think, well, a couple of shiny things and aye, that was fine and it kept it going. But when you actually drill down, as we'll go through, there are, obviously kind of downs to start with and a lot of ups. And from my point of view too, Walter being in, okay, there was the, managing to win the league, in the 4 games, which was great. This was really the test in terms of establishing himself. And I always had the golden thread, from Wilton, Stuth, Simon Waddle, Big Wallace, Greg, Walter Smith, now a Rangers man, something coming up. And now when you look at it, as David said, this was such a kind of key season, in terms of obviously how things panned out. So I'm looking forward to going through it with you guys again, yeah.
Forgive me for repeating myself, but I always seem to start these shows, especially the first episode in the group of 4, by saying, interesting season this. And then it kind of is. We know that 86, 87 is. That it's kind of been done to death. Next month, we know what's coming as we discuss 92, 93, and we obviously know what comes near the end. But there's so much groundwork done here that prepares the way for that season of all seasons. And you're right, David, it is not this linear progression straight to that treble win in near European glory. Let's start in the summer, because we're going to talk a lot about the summer of 1991. It was big. Only that the 2 summers that bookend the period that we're looking at here, the summer of 1986 and 1998, saw more transfer activity than this particular summer. 5 players in, 5 players out, easily the highest turnover of players in the close season of any that made up the 9. But David Smith had very little choice, because this is where Europe's foreigners rule really starts to take root and to start really impacting on us. It was 4 foreigners in 1991-92, but gone were the grace period, the grace players for Rangers. That would have been, before then, Woods, Butcher, Wilkins, Walters, who had Woods and Walters were still in the books at the end of that season. But the players who had been there before the summer of 88, any English players, would be naturalised Scots. They had 3 years out. That was coming to an end. There was no room for manoeuvre. And I guess domestic pressures put the blocks on any kind of forward planning. We needed to hoover up the best Scots we possibly could. We're going to go into detail now, but just in general, that it's not easy to do. We talk a lot on Seagulls, David, our English show, about, and I'm sure we will when we get back in August, about clubs who have these mad summers, big turnover, loads of names in, loads of names out. It's really hard to get right, and cohesion shouldn't be expected in the early part of the season.
No, absolutely, but we're football fans and we're unreasonable. And I think that increasingly we don't apply the rules, and I think it's got worse through time actually rather than better, but we don't apply the rules we would expect to be applied to us when we started a new job. I don't know about you, but it's always taken me a few weeks to find out where things are kept and what the system is in a workplace. And workplaces generally allow you that, but in football they tend not to, although I think that managers are a bit brighter when it comes to that. It's great when a player hits the ground running, but it's not automatic that they will, especially in this highly tactical era that we're in at the moment, when you have to learn. I think as we record in the summer of 2022, that John Lundstrom's a great example of that, of a guy who clearly just didn't know at first what was going on in the Rangers midfield, and once he settled in, became a pivotal part of the side. That summer we had known about this, but it still requires a bit of bravery to do it, because I know the great cliche is that you always mend the roof when the sun is shining, and it's true. You should strengthen from a position of strength. But what if you don't want to get rid of all the players? What if it's not that you feel these guys are coming to the end of their usefulness? It's that, we would play them in a key competition, so I'm going to have to go out there and look for players. Now, I think that the players that were being brought in were very highly thought of. I think that helped. They were players who had a reputation and who had very much been people that had impressed in the past. But equally, Yeah, I've argued, and I will to my dying day, that I think that in terms of selling Chris Woods for 1.2 million, bringing Andy Gorham for 1 million, and therefore having had the years of Woods, making a 100% profit on him, and actually making money on the deal, has to go down as possibly one of the greatest transfer deals of all time. But it didn't feel like that in summer 1991. It felt like we were being parted. And Woods was, along with Butcher, had been one of our shiny things. Our England goalkeeper, because he was now the England goalkeeper, undisputed after Shilton's retirement. And it felt like a downgrade. As much as we did like Andy Gorham, I think that's important. Andy Gorham had impressed a great deal at Hibs, and he'd always been popular. I remember his first Scotland cap when he was at Oldham, and he came on and the whole stadium was chanting his name. He was just a likeable bloke, and he had impressed at Hibs, but you're losing the England goalkeeper and you're bringing in the Hibs goalkeeper. And Rangers fans, well, they haven't changed in 30 years. I think we'd agree. We do have that slight sniffiness about buying from the Scottish League. And I would say that it was at its height in this period.
Unless it's a backup. Unless it's a kind of squad filling out and having those kind of options, absolutely. But you would argue, let's talk about the first one then, which is buying Gorham and selling Woods. Probably for the first time, Alan, since Souness's arrival, since the revolution, this felt like a backwards move in the transfer market. Because up until then it had been more. We can go out and sign pretty much anyone. The world's your oyster. There are no limits, other than Serie A. But everything seemed to be moving in a kind of positive, upwardly mobile direction. And as incredible as it is to say, because we know how this story ends, but David's right. In the summer of '91, I don't think the general mood amongst Rangers fans was this is a move that needed to happen for footballing reasons, and we've got a better goalkeeper than we had. This was seen as a backward step for the first time. Yeah,
I would agree. And as you say, for the previous, 3 or 4 years, continually it was players, we're a certain standard, but it's an upgrade. We're bringing somebody else in. And as you said, this did look, again, as David said, great goalkeeper Andy Gorham at Hibs as well, well respected, doing well, verging in Scotland now and then. So, but again, Chris Woods, you said it all. I would say the one thing about Big Woods, though, after his illness a wee bit, I didn't feel he hit the heights. It wasn't quite a Stuart Kennedy one, where he was doing so well. But I think after it went down a wee bit, but my goodness, again, still England goalkeeper. And I think he ends up leaving us and he'll play in all the Euro Championship games as well. Yeah. So that says everything.
Just on a general point, I'm interested in both of your views here before we get into, again, some of the specific transfers. What that represented was a general thing, which was Rangers, because of the UEFA directive, again, an illegal one, had to be more Scottish. We had to, that summer was about kind of rediscovering a Scottish identity, when really the previous 4 or 5 summers had been about shedding that Scottish identity. It had been getting, not that we never signed Scottish players, but they had to be super good, like Johnson or Goff. And this was about going the other way. Can you remember, amongst the pubs and the buses and talking to your pals or whatever, how that felt? Was there a pride that we were rediscovering that Scottish identity, or was there a kind of, that's not the way Europe's going, and how are we supposed to realise these ambitions by becoming more Scottish?
I think in the first couple of weeks, Martyn, as you remember, we're still, obviously there was the Aberdeen game, so there was the kind of Rangers, and again it was people backs to the wall, and even the crowd, there was sort of this renewed, we've all got to, so there was this kind of unification, I felt with us. Then when it came into this one too, there was still the feeling of, and it's Walter now and it's Archie, so that was a positive on the balance sheet. But as you say, on the other side of it, the reason we had been bringing in these other players was because Europe, and I think there's even I saw one video of David Murray talking about it, and now we really need to challenge it, Europe, we need to push on. But there was definitely a sense of, these guys are going to, again, will be fine domestically, but I can't really see now a couple of the signings later on, like so, we'll get into Big Miko and so on, but certainly the likes of Andy Gorham coming in, it definitely was an upgrade. It wasn't an upgrade anyway. Yeah. And I think Davy Robertson became a bit different again because improvement, and it was similar to Gary Stevens on the right-hand side. But yeah.
Davy, just a general sense of maybe going back the way, because we were going back the way, we were becoming more Scottish because we had to. But that, Alan's mentioned exactly there, Murray, and that summer, absolutely right. We've done 3 in a row, but now we really need to look towards European football. It's hard to do when your transfer ambitions are becoming more inverted rather than outward looking. Can you remember that sense that summer, just generally?
Oh yeah, absolutely, because it was a limitation, and people don't like limitations that are forced upon them in general, I think. And that I'd sort of grown up now in this period, in this last 5 years, where the world was our oyster, and we could go out and we could sign anyone from anywhere, and that they could come in. Kuznetsov hadn't worked out or whatever, but we could look at England in particular as a very, very good market for us. And now we're being told, actually, no, players have to basically come from within the country. Basically, as it looked to me as a small boy, was that, so what, we have to sign the Scotland squad now. Mm-hmm. Is that, essentially is that it? And it is a limitation, and it is a step backwards. And when you're forced into something like that against your will, when you've got the money sitting there to go out and bring in players, again, it just seemed designed, as I think was pretty clear at the time, that UEFA and FIFA were very keen on making sure certain football associations were well represented. They knew that the English clubs were coming back into it. They didn't want a repeat of what it had been before the ban, which was the European Cup kind of heading there basically every year. And this was done, if you look at the sides, who had the strongest international teams. It was Germany, it was Italy, and it was very much designed for them. And I just felt that we were being punished. We were being forced to look inside. As you mentioned, it is illegal. And to me, it without an understanding of employment law or anything at the time, it just felt limiting, and it felt like it was... You have to understand, if you're younger, that Serie A had the sort of dominance that the Premier League has now. And I kind of felt they had enough advantages as it was.
And they had a self-imposed foreigner limit on domestic competition, Serie A.
So they were fine with it. They wouldn't struggle, basically. To me, even then, I just felt it was designed because the English clubs were coming back. They feared that... And I counted us in that, as a side who could, because at that time I did believe we could win European trophies. And I just felt this was their way. And if people think I'm being paranoid, and I wouldn't say I'm the most Eurosceptic Martyn person in the whole world, but look at what happened. I always think a good example of that, the power that certain countries had in UEFA at the time, when the following season, when... Stuttgart, yeah. Now, any other country would have just been kicked out. Yeah. But we have this strange... with Leeds, we have this, you go and have a playoff. No, you don't have a play. Your rules are very clear. If you play an eligible player, you are kicked out of the competition. And if it happened to any other country, bar Italy, then it would have happened. So I think that at the time, there was this sense, and I think this was a punishing move, but I just, to have to get rid of, and Woods to me was part of that. Yeah. What he represented the revolution, and he represented, there was a pride in having him there. We've got Chris Woods, the England goalkeeper, and there he is playing for Rangers. Look at, you get a certain sense of, I don't know, superiority and confidence, because he was a very good goalkeeper. And as I say, I liked Gorham, but it did now feel that we were having to sell off the family silver, and we had a very, very limited market to buy replacement cutlery.
I felt also that the Mark Walters one, I know that'll be later on, but again, this was another one. Now, Butcher obviously had gone kind of previously, but again, as you say, there was just so much of this revolution, we're on our way now. We're probably 70% towards, we're doing everything off the park now, we're building the stadium, and it's as if somebody just kind of pulled the rug a wee bit, and it was like, you couldn't even go back and restart again because they had changed the rules.
It's interesting, that sense of the rug being pulled, and if you look at the transfer business, I think we've kind of discussed this when talking about the 3 foreigners rule, 4 foreigners it would be in 91, 92. As if it came out of nowhere. Oh, this summer they're doing it. It was in effect from 1988, but no one was really either. Well, they'll change their mind, or football managers being as they are short-termist, because I might not be here in 2 years to enjoy some of the kind of long-term planning that they were talking about. I need to win the next trophy at Rangers. I need to win the next game at Rangers. So we just kidded on that it was coming, really, and then we had to also deal with it. You're right, Alan. We Gorham, or we Wood, sorry, that he had gone through that illness this season before the last, 89-90. I think he did come good in 1981. To be honest, he was pretty good, nowhere near his earlier levels, but still a super player. But Souness had earmarked Gorham. He had looked to do a deal for Andy Gorham, obviously before that summer, and he writes of this caper really in his book. He doesn't name the player in his book, but he's strongly hinted at it in kind of his speaking engagements that it is Gorham, and the deal could have been done, but the player demanded 30 grand.
It was like something from an Ian Rankin.
He demanded 30 grand up front, and as soon as he's like a bit of a reputation, the gambler, blah blah blah. I didn't really want David Murray being involved in that, so I pretty much agreed for this kind of personal loan. I agreed to meet in Edinburgh, near Tynecastle actually, where his apartment was. Then he felt he'd been followed by this motorbike up and down whatever street he went. This motorbike was following. He managed to lose him because he said he knows those streets like the back of his hand, but he lost trust in the whole thing and pulled out of it, didn't want anything to do with it. Rangers had to take that gamble though, because they needed Scottish players, and Gorham, let's not be coy about this. Gorham was still well thought of. He was a Scotland goalkeeper in the summer of 1981. But again, as you've mentioned, David, just kind of getting rid of such a key player. The other sale, big sale, and there are a couple, was Trevor Steven to Marseille. Now, Steven had only been there for 2 seasons, of course. You could probably blame Graham Souness for this as well, because Marseille went to meet Souness to talk about a deal for John Barnes. That was their original target. Souness wasn't for budging, but he suggested to Bernard Tapie that Trevor Steven might be a player that fitted your bill. And for $5.5 million, Alan, Rangers could not turn down that kind of money. And I remember very acutely at the time a sense of deflation, because all I'd known, again, is this upwardly mobile sense of Rangers, he who dares wins, Rodney, we can, anything is possible, and we are on the up, and we can buy anyone. Anyone that left Ibrox in my lifetime, or my consciousness, was because Graham Souness didn't want them there. It was his agency, his decision. Maybe with the exception of Robert Fleck, actually, and we discussed that earlier. That was outside issues, not really footballing ones. But other than that, Souness got rid when he wanted. This was the first feeling I ever had that, there are much bigger clubs out there and they can outmuscle us, and we have to sell when they come calling. And I was devastated when Trevor Steven went.
You mentioned during your lifetime, you'll have heard John Cowden and I going on way back to the 70s. People, they leave Rangers when Rangers want them to go. This just didn't happen. And as you say, I think what got me to Trevor Steven, I've mentioned in previous shows with you guys too, when he started getting into the middle as well, my God, we're talking like top class, and okay, you couldn't refuse the $5 and a bit million then, but again, it became it wasn't quite a selling club, But again, it really slapped us in the face. If someone else can come who's bigger now, and at the time we thought biggest in Britain, we can go to, someone's coming in and they're picking this guy who certainly wouldn't have been, I wouldn't imagine many Rangers supporters would have went, yeah, here's someone you can let go. I think we'd have wanted to hold on to Trevor Stevens. So, yeah, this was disappointing. I mean, I think if you think of the team he was going to as well, he was going over there to join me, so like Papan, Chris Waddle, Bolly, Stojkovic, Mark Libera, Didier Deschamps, so some cracking players. But from a Rangers point of view, I felt this was a big, big miss, Martyn, yeah.
They've just been in the European Cup final, Davy. Marseille, dreadful game. Lost on penalties to Red Star Belgrade, of course. But yeah, this would have been, the Butcher thing was a bit of a shock and all of that, but I was of the opinion, young as I was, that the manager knows best. Again, this is our decision. I was absolutely gutted. I loved Stephen, and it was just this kind of reminder that all right, we have a place in this pecking order, and it's maybe not as high as I maybe believed that it was.
I think because I was a Serie A fan, I'd always known there was a higher tier. And you even just need to look at the fees that they paid over there. So I'd always known there was one above. I felt we could compete with England. We'd shown that. I felt we could compete with anyone else. But Italy at the time had this ability to outbid. So I think it goes back to when Ian Durrant got injured. I remember Souness saying afterwards, I hoped he would go one day and to play in Italy, because that was, the ultimate test. That's where you went if you were a superstar player. So I'd always known that. But yes, there was that feeling of, this is unusual, because we hadn't lost players because we hadn't wanted to in the past. We'd lost players because a decision was taken. They weren't always popular decisions. I remember being gutted when Terry Butcher left. But we sold players because Graham Souness decided we should sell that particular player. So all of a sudden, to lose a favourite, and I loved Trevor Stephen. I think he was absolutely superb in his first spell at Rangers. But I think that I bought into we'll look at money, because it was a huge fee.
Yeah.
I mean, for Scottish football, I know that younger listeners might be going, 5.5 million? Trust me, in 92, 5.5 million was a staggering amount of money. And it seemed to make sense. So I was okay with it so long as it would be reinvested, which it was, so long as we would get in more. I say reinvested like I was conscious of those terms. Yeah. So long as we would buy more things with it. And I just had this sense of disappointment, but I think mentally I was aware that there was a higher tier at the time. And again, not really understanding economics or football. It had always been that way, so I just assumed it always would be, Italy. France coming up through the rails was a bit of a surprise. But you mentioned Marseille had just been in a European Cup. They had Chris Waddle. So they'd been quite high profile in the UK because of that. And again, Scottish players in the late 80s had quite often gone over to France. Mo Johnston's a great example. But guys like Ray Stephen at Nancy and Eric Black, who people might forget. Eric Black was a super player, and he went off to Metz in France. So I think there was always the sense that this could happen, but it hadn't. So it was an unusual feeling, an uncomfortable one, but one I kind of could get my head round because of this upper tier. Again, though, what it meant to me was, well, as we get better, this might happen more often. Because players are going to come in, teams are going to come in for our players, and obviously as we get more successful, this might happen. And does this mean that every season one of our superstar players might be off to Italy, for example, might be off to Milan or to Juventus or whatever? So it did take a wee bit of coming to terms with, but I kind of understood the place that it came from.
Yeah, David, you said the size, in the other tier as well. He actually equalled the David Platt to Barry from Villa. So to give you an idea, that £5 or a bit million, I mean, in terms of British transfers going out as well, I mean, it was massive at the time. So it wasn't even your 1-2 millions, wasn't it? You know, so to actually equal the British transfer record at that point going out, I mean, that said a lot, didn't it, for the size of it? Yeah.
Another departure, much loved, and this was really his own. He moved for his own reasons. Although, as another Englishman, I think Rangers were more than amenable to the deal with Mark Walters, because he wanted to play for England. Graham Taylor had made it pretty clear that doing the biz against Aberdeen wasn't going to cut any mustard. So he left to Liverpool to be with Graham Souness again, which rankled a wee bit. But Davy, Woods, Walters, Stephen, these are three Englishmen, of course, 3 foreigners now, but 3 favourites. I mean, genuine. You can maybe lose one of those in a summer, and it kind of stings. But those are 3 really beloved players,
and it felt that way. I think we'd been used to a high turnover of players under Souness, and we all joke about it. But he did like to bring somebody into the dressing room every kind of 2-3 months, and you were used to players, but there were certain ones that seemed to be above that. You know, certain guys that crown jewels, if you like, that weren't to go. Losing Walters was a huge blow, because he was one of those players that no matter your age, he was thrilling. And he was consistent, and he had that lovely habit of doing it in Old Firm matches, which or against Aberdeen. So it was a lot to take in. What I would say is that there was a sense of the new, and I've spoken about this, and I know you've touched on it in your book, but going from the 80s to the 90s, there was a whole sense of new and building up to the millennium and all of that kind of thing. And I think that there was a freshness about the place, because of the players that are coming in, and the names, and more importantly, the fees spent. I remember doing a show with Stuart Monroe, and he said that he stayed throughout his whole time when Souness kept buying left backs. He said, because of the fees paid, because I thought, no, I've got a chance. He said, when Rangers paid £1 million for Davy Robertson, I went, no, I'm leaving, because they'll play him. They have to play him at that particular fee. So I think the fact that you couldn't argue that within the parameters that we've discussed, ambition was being shown, and that they were trying to get in. And of course, if you look at, I believe the total fee combined for Gorham and Davy Robertson was 1.97 million. And if you can find me 5 Rangers fans out there who think that wasn't a really good spend of that money, then well done.
And this is a really interesting thing. As much, again, all I have is old follows, old tabloid hotlines. It was an emotional wrench, but there was an acceptance and a quiet confidence at the start of the season that Rangers had actually done really good business. And some of the best business, Davey, was in one of our biggest recruit that summer from Serie A. I know we'd bought players from Serie A before, but in Graham Souness and Trevor Francis, fair to say, weren't at the peak of their career. £2 million spent on Alexei Mikhailichenko from Sampdoria, the winners and Serie A champions at that time.
Excellent, yeah.
I'm interested in your thoughts on Miko, Davey, because I know you were and still are a Serie A fanboy. Losing Stephen, losing that class, somewhat assuaged by this signing, because this was big kudos to Rangers, Murray in particular, that we were able to get a player like that. Had impressed at the Euros in '88,
yes.
And with Kiev, and now this part of this Serie A winning Sampdoria team for £2 million, and we've sold our player for more than double that. We're doing this transfer market thing right.
And Murray was very good at letting you know that.
Yes.
He was out there and he was saying those expressly, overtly. He was saying, we've just brought in the captain of Sampdoria, which he was, which to this day, knowing what we know about Miko puzzles me. But I'll always remember, incidentally, that the Scottish Sun, I can't remember the journal, but he's out there, said he's been compared to Brian Robson. That is
and
the
fact
worst
they're
comparison.
both, yeah.
It must have been the fact that they both like to drink. My dad had a theory about Mikhailichenko that he dropped a £1 coin in one of his earliest matches at Ibrox around the halfway line and then spent the rest of his career looking for it. Outrageously talented footballer who, like a lot of guys who were just coming out of the former Soviet bloc, were, they got a whole lot of freedom at once, and they were determined that they were going to enjoy it. But at the time, the stature of this guy was huge. As you say, a superstar player, a world superstar. Absolutely no doubt about it. You'd seen him at these big tournaments. That mystery, that air of mystery that still existed in football then, because you couldn't watch every single match from every single league. You would get. I got an hour of Serie A highlights a week from my uncle, who would tape them for me on fledgling cable shows, right? So you got goals or whatever, and even then that made me probably massively more lucky than most people. But so this guy's coming. He's got the reputation. He's got the and players simply didn't leave Serie A at the top of their career. They perfectly illustrated by the two guys you mentioned there, Souness and Francis. A, they wanted back to Britain, and B, they were in their 30s. Liam Brady was another one. When he left Serie A, he was in his 30s, and he goes to West Ham. Doesn't go to a top English side. So it just didn't happen. People who had been successful, and Miko was successful in Italy. People who were successful in Italy did not leave at the top of their career. So you bring in this huge name, and he, and more literally, but you bring in this huge name, a guy we all knew, a guy we'd seen play for Kiev and Sampdoria, a guy that we'd watched at World Cups and at Euros in particular, as you mentioned, Euro 88. And to then bring him in, I think, was a comfort blanket of, okay, we might not be able to buy many of these guys because of this rule, but we can buy them, and therefore we'll just pick the quality ones and we'll put that in. And then you do have Murray using the media well, which he did, to say, look at this. Look at what we've done here. We've just basically replaced, and we've made a profit on this, which means we'll go back into the market next year. That's how we're going to do this, go ahead dynamic. There was a freshness, there was an energy, and I think that there was an immense trust in the Rangers support that I think would actually get too much, and I think became, first of all, deferential, and then it became, not only do we not criticise, we actually get upset if anyone does. And I think that allowed mistakes to happen. But at that time, trust in David Murray, trust in the way Rangers were run, was huge, was absolutely massive. And again, and I can't get this across enough to younger listeners, this is the era of no transfer windows, right? This is the era of players coming in and out of all clubs. There was a sense of, well, we've got money, so if it doesn't work, it was by somebody else. I remember at the time hearing on a phone-in a non-Old Firm fan say the fundamental difference between Rangers and Celtic fans after a defeat. Celtic fans say sack someone, Rangers fans say buy someone. And that's where this comes from. So there was a sense of, well, if it doesn't work, it will buy somebody else. We felt like we had this room to manoeuvre. Yeah,
you touched on something I think very important there, Davey, just within the realms of the new rules as they were this summer. That we won't have loads of these players anymore because we can't play them all, but we'll have good ones and it'll be more concentrated. But I think what you get then, and what we will see throughout the 90s, is, well, we have him and we have him, day something. And that does not quite mean that they're integrated into a kind of working system, as we will find out. Alan, just generally on the Miko signing and the statement that made in response to losing someone like Stephen, or potentially losing someone like Stephen. I think Miko might have been in the door first, but clearly the Stephen thing was certainly on the cards. Because, as David said, this isn't a journeyman at the end of his career, although he may well having the mindset that his career was already over and he was just coming to put his feet up.
We were excited, and he was welcomed. I mean, you're talking, it was like 4 Soviet leagues, 3 Soviet Cups, Cup Winners' Cup, as David said, go and win Serie A as well. And obviously we knew of him internationally in Dynamo Kiev, so it definitely was. I think the question I had was, what is he doing? Is he replacing someone? It's not a like for like. Although we ended up playing him on the left-hand side, he wasn't really that kind of player. He's not exactly a kind of Trevor Steven, kind of holding, but he was just such a wonderful player. One of those guys that, if you remember, even as a kid, you're playing football, you look over and you can spot them. Boys walking, you go, he looks the part. Miko was the opposite. He walked onto the park and you're thinking, geez, but what he could do in terms of his passing, and actually was pretty good two-footed as well. Yeah. But he was just such an intelligent player. And normally we talk about cult players and it's a kind of laughing at them, Sibo or whoever it would be. But to me, he always struck me as a kind of cult player, but he was just a top-class player. In fact, hands up, I know we're a bit more sophisticated, but I think Miko was my password, the computer at, the office when it all started. Yeah. So I just loved the guy.
His full name? Because that would be quite impressive.
David, I struggled to do.
Listen, writing a book and having to reference Alexei Mikhailichenko is a pain in the arse.
No, that would be pleasant. I'm going to tell my favourite Miko story. We were playing St Johnstone at McDermott Park, not this season, a couple of seasons on it, and he was on the bench with Ian Durrant. Right, and Walter Smith sent the two of them out at the time, 2 subs, sent them out to warm up. And Ian Durrant did 6 full pelt laps of the half, our half, if you like. Yeah. He bolted up and down. Miko stood up, stretched, yawned, and then waited at the halfway line to come on. You couldn't not love him. I mean, to the point where I think it's in you'll remember this, Martyn, in one of the season review videos where John Brown is asked about him by Andy Cameron, who was the host, and he said, well, actually, I don't think we get enough out of him. and you could say that because he could do it, and he would do these extraordinary things every so often. He was like a disinterested girlfriend that every time you were just losing the head would do something to remind you why you loved her.
That's exactly it with Miko. But we'll get into his what he could do in due course. One upgrade, and this happened very late because the Stephen deal pretty much went into the start of the season, but it did go over the line, and 2 games had gone by the time we signed Stuart McCall from Everton. Again, another one that made perfect sense. Scottish player, and had been very good at Everton, been very good for Scotland in the World Cup the summer before, and scored, in fact. A lot of energy, a lot of bustle, could pop up with a goal, could break things up, and Terry Hurlock went the opposite way, not to Everton, but back down south. I think it's fair to say, Davey, that was an Anglo trade-off that I think we were probably happy with overall. Yeah.
I don't think anybody was fooling themselves about what Terry Hurlock was, right? So I don't think that, he was cult hero, etc. Everyone liked him, but he was a limited footballer. There's no doubt about that. McCall had this again in an era where you don't watch somebody every week. He'd popped up with a few high-profile moments. The FA Cup final, the Hillsborough year, which actually really starts his Everton career. He was struggling a wee bit, but he comes off the bench and he scored twice. Now, at the time, the FA Cup final was an enormous thing, and that particular one, in '89 was just enormous. So he had those. Then he scores that goal for Scotland at the World Cup. Scotland scoring at a major tournament's quite a rare thing.
Yeah, against Sweden.
Against Sweden in a huge victory. And again, I think we really we liked him. We definitely could see the attraction in Stuart McCall. You could see it. I mean, for me, I felt he would do for us what Spackman had done, even though they were different players, operated in roughly the same area at the pitch. Yeah. But I felt he could take that particular role on. I'd never really felt Terry Hurlock a first team player, if that makes sense. I'd always felt of him as a fill-in, as a back second tier. And I felt that McCall, I would prove to be correct, would be that. But he had a good profile. at that time. And that helped when you were signing a player because, as I say, people couldn't say, whereas now we can go and we can look at someone and make a judgment very quickly. Back then you couldn't. You didn't have reams of footage available to you. So reputation was good in terms of getting the player the buy-in at the start that they need. And it's funny, actually, Martyn, you and I were at NASA, and one of the guests was David Robertson. And he talked, I asked him at a Q&A, what was it like, back then to walk in from Rangers? Because you were at Aberdeen, who, as we've discussed on this show, were our biggest rivals at this point. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to say. And he said, I was terrified. He said, because Rangers, he goes, it was like joining a different league. He said, even, coming down from Aberdeen. He said, Aberdeen wanted to sell him, but they had to go through that ridiculous pantomime, of it's the player's fault. He said, so they took his car off him, his sponsor car. He says, there were reserve players had won. He says, I go to Rangers. He goes, and it wasn't much of a car. He goes, but it was at least free. He says, I get to Rangers, and day one, they're like, right, phone this, and you can go and get your car. He's like, all right, what kind? And anyone you want. And he's like, okay. He said, and I walked in, and he said, I was terrified. Jimmy Bell said to him, there's your training gear. Your number is number 6. By the way, the last guy who had that was Terry Butcher, so don't fuck this up. And he said, he goes, I was genuinely, he says, the type of person I am, if I'd have got off to a bad start, he said, I worry if I'd have been able to cope with it. But of course, we win 6-0 in the first game, and the fans immediately see what he can bring to the club. But this was a £1 million signing from a team that had been up at the top end of the table, and he feels coming to Rangers is like going to a completely different level. What he said to me, he says, it felt like coming out of the lower divisions, just the way everything was done, just the way everything was run, just the size of the club. And that is maybe the concern, that we've had these huge characters, the Butchers and Trevor France. You mentioned Trevor France. We were bringing in all these guys who had these enormous reputations, and now we're bringing in a different type of player. So to go back to an earlier point, that settling in period, something we hadn't really, because Souness never expected it. He would bring somebody in for 3 months. Come in, do me a turn, and then I'll sell you again. So it's a completely new era. And
David Robertson was actually a Souness signing. It was done. It was agreed. Robertson knew he was leaving the season before. The fee was settled by tribunal, a fee of nearly £1 million, and I think Robertson talks about feeling the pressure when David Murray said, well, you better be fucking worth it. But there wasn't much consternation about this one. If anything, I know you love Stuart Monroe, Davey, and listen, club servant, he did a turn. But I think left back was probably the one area of the park throughout the Souness era that we hadn't quite fully upgraded to that kind of level. And he tried to get Stuart Pearce and Tony Dorigo and all sorts. He just hadn't quite managed to do it. No. Whereas I don't think, even though he was coming from a Scottish club, I think everyone knew that this boy was probably the best left back in the country.
I loved David Robertson. So that if somebody had to replace Sir Stuart, then David Robertson was the ideal fit. Every time I'd seen him play for Aberdeen, I thought, because he was the closest I'd seen in Scotland to Gary Stevens, in that he had that modern thing of, he didn't see it as his job was to just hang back and clear the ball. Basically, he was quick, and that was one thing I think that Rangers defence at times lacked. Goff and Butcher, terrific player. They're not renowned for their speed. Monroe wasn't a speedster, and again, he was young. I remember at the time my dad saying to me, "That's a future captain." Now it didn't work out that way, because it turned out during the spell we didn't need another captain. But he was such a terrific attacking player in an era where that was just beginning to be a thing. And of course, when Laudrup signs, then my goodness, then suddenly
Yeah.
you've got this wonderful combination that people often forget and maybe downgrade Davy Robertson's part in that. But he was often involved in moves with Laudrup and created a lot of space for Laudrup, which is key. And that allowed a guy who normally had 2 or 3 players on him to just find that bit of room. But even at the time, I remember thinking £1 million for him was a bargain.
Yeah.
David, even linking up with Hooster as well, even in this particular season.
He was just a quality player. And also, one of the things I really like about David Robertson is the Scotland thing, where he said, "I'm not getting dragged about to not play. If you want to, basically," and he was spot on. If you want to play me, pick me, fine. But I'm not going to Moldova for 2 weeks to train. And he got criticised for that, but I think that was absolutely the correct thing to do. Over and above his football career, he, as he said himself, he had a young family, and he didn't want to be constantly going away to not even get a game. Yeah. But he was just a super player. And again, we're kind of fortunate. Can you imagine a 3 foreigners rule now? I think our European adventures would be somewhat. At least there was this quality out there that could be picked up.
Alan, your thoughts, your recollections in the signing of both McCall and Robertson, who I think we can probably agree were upgrades and where we're, genuinely the best that Scotland could probably provide for those positions, given that now we needed to find the best that Scotland could possibly provide.
Absolutely. I mean, Stuart McCall, I think, as you said, compared to Terry Hurlock, best of luck, but Stuart McCall, head and shoulders. I actually think even above Nigel Spackman too. I know he brought a lot, but no, to me, Stuart. Well, that's my opinion, But no, I thought Stuart McCall.
I'll call it a tie.
Okay, yeah. Some of his passing as well, I think, is very underrated. There's quite a good few important goals as well. But anyway, I love Stuart McCall. Absolutely brilliant. Heart of a lion. Usual kind of cliche. Davy Robertson as well, and again I loved Stuart Monroe. I thought he was great up that left hand side, even with the kind of time with Cooper and so on. Really great servant. But no, Davy Robertson, and it gave us that balance. Even on Old Rangers Day, now you were suddenly get full backs, and I was used to them. They've got to obviously defend, and if they get over the halfway line, fine. Sandy was an exception, but now we've got 2 with Gary Stevens down the right and with Davy Robertson. No, I just thought they were. It was a cracking addition to our squad and our team as well, Martyn, yeah.
Because they could defend. Both of the guys we've mentioned, they had grown up that era. It wasn't like, we're not talking this kind of modern thing where you say the defending is the weakest part of the game. Both of them were it. How many times did Davy Robertson through his time at Rangers cut across and be the recovery player? Yeah. And it's not luck, it's what he was in the team to do. So, no, I think, two good bits of business.
Well, you're talking about NASA, David, where you were lording it up at the top table at the Memorial Ball dinner. I was at the Wags table beside Mrs. Robertson.
Next to Ethel Smith, I was. Yeah, that's who I was. That was who my dinner.
Well, my dinner date was Mrs. Robertson, and she was very, very kind, and we had a great chat. But Andy Gray's wife kept referring to, where are you two living now? How long have you been here? Kind of thing. I think she thinks we're married, but we had to kind of put her right. Right. Besides having to rebuild half a team, Davey, Walter Smith's biggest problem as this season dawned was the same one that Graham Souness had wrestled with, self-inflicted, I guess, the season before, which was this attacking triumvirate and how to play them, and how to use them, and who comes in, who doesn't. McCoist had suffered another kind of pre-season with injury. Finally had a hernia diagnosed, got it treated, but he was a couple of weeks behind. But even then, he writes in his book around that time actually that he expected to start that first game against St Johnstone, but he pulled a thigh muscle in training. I'm not sure I quite believe that, but Smith went with Haitley and Johnston anyway. I think he would have gone with that, to be honest, in any event. And they filled their boots, and McCoy had said he's back on the bench, back reprising that role of the judge. He said, I'm coming up for 29, couldn't afford another season like the previous one. I had to have first team football for the sake of my career, although I didn't want to leave Rangers. I would have to start thinking about taking that seriously. I told him that despite all the problems I had, I never said that to his predecessor. But McCoy's issue was Smith, he's getting it right. I mean, Johnson and Hateley, the Rangers scored 24 goals in the first 5 league games and 2 Skull Cup games, 13 of them coming from Johnson and Hateley. They absolutely enjoyed themselves, especially that first day win against St Johnstone. Big Hateley looking as if that final day salvation against Aberdeen had really kick-started his Rangers career. David, he scored 3, Johnson scored 2. Away we go.
I'm going to use a little bit of Ramsey, Ramseyan, I suppose would be the phrase, logic here, which is we're a great believer in turning points, aren't we? That there's one moment, and it's easy with Mark Hateley to say that Aberdeen game, but of course turning points are usually just a very obvious representation of something that was already happening. With that said, Mark Hateley turns up with a new haircut, the longer hair, and all of a sudden is just, I think he knows now I'm fully fit and I've had a pre-season and I'm settled. And Mark Hateley is suddenly what we all think of now when we think of as Mark Hateley, noticeably right from the start of that season. He had been playing well and getting goals towards the tail end of the previous year as he got fitter. But I do think just the confidence in his own mind of I'm fully fit and I've had a pre-season and I'm good to go. And I'm number one choice, incidentally, because as you've touched on many times on this show, it was Hateley and one. Yeah. It wasn't McCoy, Johnson or Hateley. It was Hateley and whoever. So you're absolutely right. He just starts that season and he doesn't let up for about 4 years. Just absolutely terrific. This combination of elegance and violence, this guy battering centre-backs, outpacing them when he's needed to do, holding the ball up, laying it off, terrorising them at set pieces, lovely finish. He's the complete striker all round. And he knows how good he is, Mark Hateley. He always has. But he's confident to take the bus. And I think like a lot of footballers, if they're not fully fit, and their body isn't doing what they tell it to do, it drains their confidence a bit. His body was doing, and now he was here, and he felt like he owned the stage. And when Mark Hateley felt like he owned the stage, then he did. This must seem, of all the stuff we talk about of back in the day, to our younger listeners, this huge problem of having 3 great players for 2 positions, I think must sound like the strangest of all.
3 internationals, David.
3 brilliant players, not for 1 position. This is not like having 3 left backs, right? This is 3 strikers for 2 roles, okay? It must have, rotate them, or pick and choose, or, one's a sub. It wasn't like that, guys. Back then, you had 2 players for the position, and usually a youngster or an acknowledged, a Paul Rideout type backup. John Spencer, Gary McSweggan would take the role. You didn't have 3 internationals. You didn't have 3 quality players. I think that we're going to have to embrace a truth which we don't particularly like because we're Rangers fans. If you're a Rangers fan of our age and above, Ali McCoist is God. Ali McCoist, the footballer. He was then, incidentally. Both Souness and Walter rated Mo Johnson higher than him. It's that simple. Because when push came to shove, they always went for him. Now, what happens is, Martyn, you touched on this in the last show, McCoist very cleverly uses his time away to tune his game to be the perfect partner for Mark Hateley. Right? And by the end of the season, as you say, he has that. And Walter is not as dogmatic as Souness. Walter doesn't say, no, because I have decided that it's Hateley and Johnston, my mind cannot be changed. Walter goes, all right, look at this. This is clearly a combo, and sells Johnston. I don't think that happens under Souness, because I think Souness, once he'd made up his mind, felt it was a sign of weakness to go back. I think, though, we do have to be honest and say that at the starting point for both of these managers, their decision, it was not Ali McCoy. He was number 3 in that pecking order. And I think it's to his credit, because if he just kept going, Ali McCoy was a wonderful striker, as he was then, and he would have gone to another club and scored lots of goals. But he didn't sit there and feel sorry for himself. He learned Mark Hateley's game inside out. It wasn't by luck. that they are. Yes, there's a bit of a click, there's a chemistry, of course there is, right? But look at the amount of great striking partnerships Ali has. Robert Fleck, O Johnston, Mark Hale. It's not luck. Ali was a very selfless player in that he would alter his game to whoever he played with because he knew ultimately that would lead to more goals and lead to more success. But not all footballers, I think, are built that way.
Yeah. I think he had the better attitude as well. Ultimately, he had the resilience, he had the that's fine, I'll bloody show you each time, each challenge that came.
Now and again, he had his moments. He did have his huffs, he did have his petty lips, but he got there. He got there in the end.
But over the period, I think like David said, it wasn't a case of, okay, he had a couple of blips and so on, but ultimately he went back and improved. And what you'll see ultimately here, you're big guy, wee guy, because when obviously we all go, and fun enough, his attitude maybe just was a wee bit more suspect than Ali's because he was wanting to play regularly, Yeah. But I think ultimately the Hateley one fully fit with McCoy, and you'll see his goal scoring record over the next. Is just phenomenal,
That's for next week because the narrative that McCoy starts that League Cup game at Tynecastle, scores that brilliant goal and is never in the team isn't true. There's a lot of mix and matching and Smith doing exactly what you said, Davey, and trying this and that, and he didn't have the same forward selection. I think one game to the next throughout September, October. A lot of that because of injury, by the way, but also wasn't quite settled. He would become settled, but that's for next week. Alan, on Hateley and that opening day, was there a connection between that day and the last game you saw at Ibrox, the 2-0 win over Aberdeen, that, this guy's here now, he's a thing?
Aye, there was. I think even if you go back the year before it, when he came to us, I remember I said, played Man United, I think, a friendly. Some guys were giving him abuse, and I'm like, hold on. The guy's come back from injury. You don't get all these caps and play where you had. So the player was in there. It took, as David said, probably that year to get to where he was. There was obviously the boost from the Aberdeen one, but he came out of the traps. And as you say, that one in particular, the whole, that acceleration, it just looked like the guy that we thought we were going to get initially, if he'd been 100% fit then, because you'll see this one, and we'll talk about, I would imagine, other games too, where against Scottish, you see the Scottish defences and all that, it was just a different class altogether. As you say, whether they wanted to fight, he could do that, whether he wanted to outpace them, and again, his link-up and his intelligence with other players. So as far as I was concerned at that point in time, and over the next couple of years, you were really seeing Hateley at his top.
Yeah, I think this opening to this season is indicative of what we're going to see. None more so than at Parkhead at the end of August. Now at Celtic, Liam Brady was now in charge. And hopes were high, of course, of a new era. If only could hold on to Paul the Maestro McStay. Now, with McStay and Collins, John Collins that is, Celtic did have a kind of ball-playing capacity in the middle of the park, but the fading light of Charlie Nicholas could not be reignited. Their big summer signing was Tony Cascarino from Aston Villa, effectively Celtic's answer to Hateley, and he was a disaster. With only 4 goals that season, he was eventually exchanged for Chelsea's Tom Boyd in the February. On that final day of August, there was no question as to who the real deal was.
This is Coyne. It was well read by Goff. McCall. Here's Hateley, he's in the clear, it's a great chance for Rangers. Hateley against Bonner. Brilliant play from Hateley. Rangers take the lead. 35 minutes to the match gone. Ecstasy there for Hateley. The first real error in defence by Celtic through the middle. One pass beat the Celtic defence. Gillespie misjudged it. White couldn't get there quickly enough. But just look at the composure of Hateley here, going wide of Bonner to make certain. Well, it's played on well by Hateley for Johnston. Here's Hateley again, switching to his left foot. It's a second for Rangers. It's Mark Hateley once again. And Pat Bonner is utterly dejected. Well, the celebrations go on among the Rangers supporters. The goal came right out of the blue. Some great forward play involving Hateley initially with a head flick. Then inquest here about how Hafey was allowed to get onto his better foot, the left, and then Pat Fowler will undoubtedly believe he should have saved that.
2-0 David. 2-0 at Parkhead. I mean, these comfortable wins at Parkhead were not something we were used to. You know, as soon as his team had started to grab a couple of big important 1-0s, 2-1s or whatever. But Hateley's first goal, just before half time, when you watch it back, it's just a piece of film. It's early on in the 90s, but it could sum up the Old Firm battle of the decade immediately. Tommy Coyne's easily dispossessed by Richard Gough, feeds it Stuart McCall, who is in acres of space in the middle of the park. Brilliant through ball, caught out Celtic's other summer signing, Gary Gillespie, leading just a scandalously high line. It's absolutely ridiculous. And Hateley suddenly in the clear of the chasing Derek White, but this power, sheer power and acceleration takes him away from White. He's got a coolness of mind just to round Bonner on this roasting hot afternoon and roll it into the net where White kind of ends up tangled into the net in a kind of mess. And this celebration running right up the Parkhead touchline, fist clenched, was just this display of power and superiority so early in a season. That goal for me, we'd see it from Hateley, we'd see it maybe from Laudrup as well throughout the decade, but that mixture of our power and precision against their utter calamity, that's the story. That's the story of the 1990s for me.
Yes, it is. And again, not to belabor the point, although I do think it bears repeating, this is now Mark Hateley. This is now Mark Hateley's territory, and he would spend an awful lot of this decade running away from Celtic players who couldn't get near him, and I suspect strongly at times didn't really want to because it wouldn't end well for them. It's a lovely finish, but you're right about the quality of the goal all in. Gary Gillespie, that's an interesting one because that Liverpool team, when you look back on it, it had its 3 or 4 superstars and a lot of your Sammy Lees and your Steve Nichols and whatnot. They were a bit like Manchester United. Do you remember clubs would always go and buy some of these Man United players thinking, well, they were at Man United, so they must have been good. John O'Shea or Wes Brown or Ji-Sung Park, and they would be absolutely disastrous because they were cogs in a machine and you took them out of that. And it makes sense on paper, doesn't it? But again, that's the difference between our transfers and theirs. There's Stuart McCall brought in because we have a specific need and a role, and Alan had mentioned earlier a very good passer of the ball, which he demonstrates here. But I just think that there was a sense with this Rangers side of we knew where we wanted to go. And there's a couple of hiccups in the early stages of the season before we get there. But we knew what we wanted to play like. We knew how we wanted the side to look. We knew who we were to feed and how to feed them. And as the sense grows and we go into the 44-game run and obviously European campaign the next year, you're right with that Band of Brothers thing as well. All of it converges because we have a plan. We know what we want to be and we're signing players. Don't always work out, touched on Miko, but we know what we want to do. Celtic are entirely reactive, really up until Burns comes. Celtic are entirely reactive. And it's about, well, we'll sign a player. And again, I mentioned Manchester United are very much an example of this at the moment. Well, look, we've bought a couple of good players. See, on paper, Gillespie and Cascarino are good players. But you're not signing... Yeah, at Liverpool, goal scorers in England. But you're not signing them because, they don't play with the target man. They never have. They've no culture of it. They don't know what the hell they're doing with it. And, people always say Cascarino was a disaster. He was, he said, but he could never understand why a club would sign him and then not put crosses into him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a legitimate shout, to be honest. It just the difference between two sides. One who know who they are, where they are and where they want to go, and build to that. And Rangers wouldn't always be like us under Murray, right? But at this point we were. And a side who don't know who they are, or they've got a big target man and that works. So we'll get one of them as well, and that'll help. And they've got a centre half that's come up from England and done well. So we'll sign one of them as well. And you're right in terms of if you want to look into a visual representation of how it would go. This is it for me because it is just that Mark Hateley, I am bigger, faster, stronger than you, and I have got more ability than you have, and I am incredibly confident that I will be able to defeat you in any particular challenge. And that sense, and again, Martyn, to quote one of your oft-quoted phrases, but it's so true, you've then got in this Rangers team a good mix of lieutenants and officers and workers, which you need. You can't have too many of one or the other. I think you do have a good mix of that, but you also have the special players. We worried about that when Walters left. We mentioned that. You now have a mix of guys that the rest of the team, when it does get tricky, when it does get a struggle, can go, we'll be all right because he's there. And if I can just keep doing my job, then he'll do something special and win us the match. And that, I think, would also be a theme of the 90s.
Alan, the second goal, quite rudimentary really, and I guess just a big punt from Gorham. But Johnson and Hateley, a couple of headers between them, and then Hateley just, sweeps the ball into, showing again why this is the combo at this particular time. I imagine you were there that day, roasting hot. I mentioned earlier, Celtic have beaten us 3-0, 2-0. Only, 5-6 months beforehand. When Souness's Rangers had gone to Parkhead, they were narrow wins. There are a few of them actually, starting to rack them up, but they were narrow wins. This was a walk in the park. And how different did that feel?
It's just so much better, as you say. Even the first time under Souness, the Celtic missing the penalty at the end, and I had periods of like 9 years or what. We were always going, but this one, it was 2-0 going on 3 or 4.
Can you remember the last time you'd gone there and watched the Rangers win that comfortable?
Oh, it's to be honest with you, I can't before that, because when the ones previously to that, there wouldn't be 2-goal wins, wouldn't it? Obviously, following on the years after that, it became more and more frequent. But in fact,
not that decade. I don't think.
No.
Even in the 70s.
Might be wrong.
Even in the 70s as well, it would be like 2-1s, and things we were beating them there, weren't we? Yeah.
We won nice stuff. And Martyn, you mentioned there, and I'd like to mention, even though it is only a couple of months, it felt, even then, like completely different eras to me. I did just feel, and it's that, there's the power of the summer reset, there's the way that the previous season had ended and all that drama. But those matches against them, both them and us, feel like things have changed already, that we've gone up and they've gone backwards. And there was a sense of kind of desperation, I think, at Parkhead as they realised that as well. And there was a sense at Rangers of, anything is possible. We had our difficulties, we're through that, still the league champions, etc., etc. So even though those games are just a few months apart in terms of, in time,
it seemed like years between them, didn't it?
It did. And I mean, I know looking back, it's easy to feel that way, but it felt like that at the time. It just felt like two completely different eras.
Can you remember, David, Big Hateley's first goal when he shoots and White goes in? But I remember seeing that in the replay of the TV, and right away they're singing, it's a grand old... the usual... It was as if the Celtic fans just hadn't got it yet. They were still... Do you know what I mean? They were still kind of lost in Celtic, faithful through and through, and it was like, rather than going, oh shit, we are so far, it was as if they were in denial. It's
I think for both sides, we've been guilty of this. We were guilty of this, really, up until we've come back to be Rangers again. That when you're that far away, you delude yourself that your side is better than it is, but is underperforming. And you delude yourself that the other side is not very good and overperforming. And therefore, the gap is actually bridgeable quite quickly. If only the players will up their game, if only a certain signing comes in, then the gap can be bridged. If only the other teams in Scotland will just get their finger out against the opposition. This is where they were right then. They had this massive overrate of their own side because they were a mess. I mean, the squad is a disaster. and they had a massive underrating of ours. I mean, I remember on phone-ins back then, Team CR Rangers are just a long ball mob. You know how Celtic especially then had this thing in their DNA that they played this incredible.
We are into the era of Cavalier football.
Cavalier, yeah.
Champion Cavalier attacking football.
Cavalier football. Rangers, on the other hand, basically what we do is we hire a digger that just lobs the ball up front, this wall of muscle, and it was complete and utter bollocks. But I think it's because, you're right, consciously they weren't realising it. Unconsciously, I think they were, and they were realising not only is this gap enormous, it's a chasm. We are miles away from it, and it's actually only going to get bigger because, you know, that day in Parkhead, it's a shithole, it's a death trap. It's, you know, and Ibrox at the time is, you know, one of the finest stadiums in Europe.
And building a new tier.
Yeah, and we were just on completely different levels. And you look at that Rangers team, Stuart McCall, you couldn't have bought him. Mark Hateley, you're not getting anyone near a player like Mark Hateley. Mo Johnston, but we all know how that worked out. And it did. Any
neutral coming up from, say, England or whatever to watch that, right away they would look at the shapes, as Martyn said, the whole, look at this, Rangers have got these guys each side, they've got a structure. Even the high ball, no, it's no humped in. The ball's played up there. Big Hateley wins the challenge. Johnson intelligently. Yeah. There was just a different class, you know, at that point.
That is it. And you mentioned, Martyn, the word at the start, alchemy. That's what it felt like. It felt like this Rangers team were coming together, and there's chemical reactions happening all over the field as people begin to know each other and begin to and with this Celtic side, it was more like a jumbo sale.
Yeah, well, alchemy is the thing. Alchemy is where we're going to get to. But you're right about chemical reactions. Ironically, given the chemical reaction that's going to take place as the months develop, what was dominant this time was Hateley and Johnson. And you know, McCoist is right to ask questions of Walter after that game. That's the 31st of August. And he says, he writes later, Walter was just superb, there's no other word for it. He said he understood my frustrations perfectly, but that he didn't want me to leave the club. He appreciated, however, my service to Rangers, and in return he wouldn't stand in my way if I really wanted to go. But he stressed again that I would get my chance and not to do anything hasty for a couple of weeks. We agreed to sit and think things over for a spell. Walter was as good as his word, and my opportunity came soon afterwards that night at Tynecastle. That night at Tynecastle would be in the League Cup, and that would come after that Celtic game. That's for next week. Gents, before we finish, we need to discuss the events at Tynecastle in the league a couple of weeks before the only defeat in this opening spell. A freak goal, David. Scott Crabb effort, speculative, came in from the Andy Gorham's left-hand side and somehow ended up in the net. He didn't move. He just completely misjudged it quite early on in that game. Early on, of course, in this Rangers legend's career. But a worrying game in general, and a worrying moment again for those who had doubts about that particular transfer.
Scott Crabb. Now there's a name that if you want to be transported to an early 90s episode of Sports Scene, that will take you back. Yeah, look, it was always mentioned repeatedly throughout this show that going to Tynecastle was certainly no gimme, and you had to be on it to get the victory there. I loved going to Tynecastle, especially in this period. It's still a good atmosphere, but back then it was
brilliant behind the goal.
It was nuts in that stadium. Marshall Chunky Chicken, etc. But yeah, like, he wasn't Chris Woods, and at this point, he's not Andy Gorham yet. So it's, you know, what's there, and it's always difficult when you have such a key position at a big club, and a goalkeeper clearly is a big club, is a pivotal position. And it's even harder when you're replacing somebody the fans really liked, and as we mentioned, didn't want to let go. But yeah, we did have concerns. Gorham gives away some very uncharacteristic, or what will come to be uncharacteristic. Actually, I'm being unfair. Uncharacteristic for what he'd been at Hibs as well. Yeah. He's giving goals away, and I use that term advisedly because these are errors that you just do not associate with Andy Gorham. Certainly, you know, in this particular era. So, look, I'll have to hold my hands up. I was beginning to wonder, you know, Is he the guy? Is he the one? Will we need to look out elsewhere? Will we need to use one of our fancy foreign players on a goalkeeper? Because you can't have a bad goalkeeper.
Yeah.
Again, I go right back to the 86-87 video, that championship season, which was my Bible and my blueprint for everything that Rangers should be, even still, at this point. And Souness says, we used to play Nottingham Forest, they had Peter Shilton. If you have a good goalkeeper, you take it from there. So at this point, I am slightly concerned because the wonder saves aren't happening yet. The match-winning displays, which we all know haven't happened yet, but the mistakes have. And Woods didn't do things like this. So I think it's probably interesting as well to maybe mention that we had sort of grown up. The Scottish goalkeeper was a term for joke, really.
Yeah.
And culturally, we'd been sort of raised to think of Scottish goalkeepers as almost being I remember on St and Greavesy every week they would criticise. So there were concerns.
And the one who had maybe raised that bar, Jim Leighton, in the last decade, had by that time turned himself into a FA Cup final and World Cup as well. Alan, just very briefly, were you at Tinkoffs that day? Can you remember any sense of angst and tension as to this boy won't do? Because you can just imagine Twitter. There's mileage in, by the way, if for anyone has the time, to be a Rangers Twitter account tweeting as live from 1986 onwards, by the way, because some of the reactions to games like this would have been insane, I think.
Yeah, people make mistakes all over the park, and we always say it if the keeper makes it. But this one, I think from memory, it was like right early on in the game.
Yeah,
and it was like it was like, I suppose if we were playing golf, it would be drawing it, but it basically was starting way out for the right hand side, but he completely misjudged it, and right away it was like, what the hell? And as David said, because we had been that comfortable with Big Woods too, and then obviously there'll be some other ones that will come up. I think that's what got me in the next so many weeks. There'll be some other ones that were clearly on him too, both European and domestically, and fortunately things turned around and ultimately became, the Andy Gorham that we all know. But certainly during the first few months of that season, it was like can we no get Woods back, or could we get somebody else? And I don't know whether the guy was just putting too much pressure on himself as well. I don't know, because he had been good, obviously, at Hibs and the other. I don't know whether it's this learning to play at Rangers too and all that goes with it.
Yeah.
But no, I distinctly remember at the time, what the hell? But as I say, I think what annoyed me too was in the next month or so, I think there was another 3 or 4 real major clangers. I think even the Hibs semi-final and things. But ultimately, and as I say, if it had been a player, we've known some Rangers legends who've taken months and months to. I mean, you're talking about Lundstrom, he's not in the legends yet, but when you think of him, but even the likes of Ian Ferguson's and some others, and it's taken them literally months to actually get up to it. It just all seemed to come, and obviously it would have added to I think his confidence as well would clearly have taken a hint to Martyn, yeah.
It certainly did. Right, gents, we're off and running in another season. Thank you, Alan.
You're welcome. Enjoyed that one.
Thank you, Davey. Back to your bed, son.
I'd go further and say you're off and running, and if ever there's a season that's a 2 season, I think it's this. Do you know, I do. I see these 2 years as very much one story.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to listening to the other ones. I'm looking forward to doing the other ones. It's, just a wonderful, wonderful period in being a Rangers supporter, and we've cleared the bad bit.
Stuart McCall made his debut. Stuart McCall made his debut at Tynecastle that day, and he felt the full wrath of Walter Smith at half time, setting out the standards that he expected. He said, Everton, that would have been something to build on. But at Rangers, you had to win every week, home or away, to be classed as successful. And although Rangers obviously recovered immediately, that win at Parkhead, and they ended the month only a point behind Hearts and Aberdeen, that Gorham blunder was a sign that Smith's new signings, especially as goalkeeper, were going to take some time to adjust. The abuse was raining down on me, said Gorham. What a waste of money. That was just the Rangers fan singing, not Hearts. It can wreck you. For Gorham and Smith, things were about to get a lot worse. Until next time, bye for now.